Welcome back to Savage Fabrication Insta-Spool Performance. I am Bradley Carter, behind the camera, Dalton Carter, who does all the editing and all that stuff to make these actually make sense because I ramble on. We've been doing a lot of videos on the VE pump. We pretty much went over absolutely everything there is to go over without taking one apart. We can't take that one apart because there's nothing wrong with it. The point at which it is taken apart to currently is very easily reassembled and put back into a truck. So it's kind of a spare pump. It's not wrecked. When we do our P-pump video, we have a P-pump with a bad plunger. We'll take it apart because why not? So we're going to use pictures to demonstrate these. I printed these up off of screenshots off the phone, off of people's YouTube videos. We will be mentioning the YouTube channel that we got the screenshots from, as well as where the original photo came from that was used in the video on YouTube. So we're going to go up to the board and we're going to talk about the next section of the VE pumps. So this is a screenshot taken from a Drosy 85 YouTube channel that had put up the entire Bosch video, instruction video that would normally go to your pump shops or service technicians back in 89 to 93 and a little bit after that while the trucks were still technically new, about how to work on and service and when to send it in to a pump builder to have it diagnosed. But understanding how the pump works would help a technician diagnose symptoms. So what we're looking at here is the roller assembly. This is stationary in the pump. Right here is the cam plate. The cam plate rotates. And then right here is just a holder that holds the return springs. It is not uncommon for these springs to be broken and only have fuel pressure be what's returning this. They will actually run just fine unless they, this was the seize up in the bore. They'll run actually just fine with broken return springs. It's not uncommon to take these apart according to shops I've talked to for those to be broken. This here is our plunger. So this plunger actuates inside of the distributor housing. Now you can see the distributor housing on your injection pump because it is external. If you look behind the shutoff solenoid towards the cab, there's a block with, in our case, 6 delivery valves attached to it. That's the housing. The delivery valves attached to the housing. This system here is in the center of that housing. Now this plunger here only has 4 slots, indicating it's for a 4-cylinder engine. The one in a 5.9 liter 6BT application will have 6 slots. So these are distribution slots. The center hole is the fill hole. This is where the fuel comes into, I shouldn't say that's where the fuel comes in. Actually, I think it might be. It's been a little bit since I watched. But actually, you know what this is? This is a common plenum to the distribution slots is what that is. So in front of this is a cavity that's going to have, from the distribution block, be fed fuel to fill that cavity. So that cavity is always trying to be filled. Now what happens is this will roll across, this cam plate will roll over these bearings and cycle this whole plunger forwards. When it cycles it forwards, what will happen is it will shut off the spill port. So this is your lower case half here, the vane pumps pumping the pressure up like we talked about in previous videos. And then there's a feed hole that feeds the top of the plunger. And it does fill this space through a non-active slot in the plunger assembly. And then once the rotor rotates, the plunger rotates and closes off this portion here and this cavity is full, this plunger plunges forward, creating pressure through this slot, the hole, that would then line up with a slot in the distribution block. And when that delivery valve becomes uncovered, that pressure will open the delivery valve and then open the injector and inject fuel and thing. When you try to comprehend how small and rapid this thing is working, it is pretty insane. But that is why the shutoff solenoid works. Here's our solenoid in the distribution block. When the plunger comes down, it shuts off the feed to the plunger itself. If the plunger can't get fuel, the truck can't run. So right here we have our plunger, and you can see this if you have your pump top off. There's a collar over top of the plunger. In between the two spring assemblies, this collar uncovers a separate spill port. Now this spill port is not a fill port. On P700s, the spill port doubles as the fill port doubles as a spill port. In this case, this hole here is only a spill port, and once it gets uncovered, the pressure that was created will get dumped off back into the case and reused again. Similar to any extra fuel from the lift pump that the injection pump doesn't need, actually either gets put back to the tank or it gets put back to the filter head itself and then reused. A lot of times it's back to the filter head versus sending it all the way back to the tank. And then whatever the pump doesn't get used that gets ran through it gets returned all the way to the tank. It's just a more efficient system that way. So this collar, in this case, is attached to what a lot of us call the fulcrum lever, which is what our fuel metering screw connects to. What the fuel metering screw does when you tighten this up, it sets the minimum depth where it resides, as well as it will increase the maximum throw. Now the maximum throw overall does not change. If this only slides 3 millimeters, then tightening this up doesn't make it go more than 3 millimeters. It just moves where that 3 millimeters is over the factory one, because what the factory does when they calibrate it is they're only going to calibrate it to flow the minimum target required to make the horsepower at the crank that the engine is supposed to make. So these machined parts can come in at a tolerance that, say, turned up could allow this much, but if it did, they would go in, decrease this, they would turn it out, so it only makes 160 flywheel. And vice versa, if the things are shorter, they will turn this in to make sure that it comes off the floor, making 160 flywheel, not 140 or 120. So you can look through, once the pump top is off, it's about this section right here. You can see down in there, if you follow the fuel metering screw, what it pushes on, like we talked about in the other videos, if you follow that lever down, you'll see this machined collar that's around the plunger. If you actuate it, you can see the spill port and the spill port on the thing. Anybody was curious, this is what the vane pump looks like. If you want to see the vane pump is all the way right behind the pump shaft, the snout. So it's literally the last thing about to come out of the case. This is a sideways depiction of it. Maybe not. This is small enough this could be correct. But it is a vane style pump, so that's why they typically never wear out. As these edges wear, the vanes just slide out further, so they last a really long time. This is the regulating valve that sets how much case pressure will be in the pump. So when the engine RPM gets really high, this valve opens up more and fuels more fuel off to hold case pressure at the recommended amount. This is why we can make more power by pushing down on that setting. Remember, we talked about it on the other videos. There's a little pin. You can tap down a little deeper, not much, to increase case pressure. You go too far, case pressure will get too high, and I'm sure all kinds of fun things happen. We've never went too far, we're real careful with it, but I'm sure some interesting stuff could happen if you did go too far with it. I don't know if you can buy replacement ones as well, and they kind of come apart, so to put them back to where they were, should it get screwed up, I'm not sure. We've never had it happen to us. We're really careful when we do it. But that is what it looks like. This is behind the cam plate. So behind the cam plate, there's some stuff that has to come out, and you can see the vane pump. So right here, we can see as engine RPM increases, the pressure inside of the case increases with it. Now there is a point where, in this instance, it would flatline. This drawing doesn't have it. You can see from 0 and then startup, it'll hop up to here, and then as engine RPM increases from idle RPM to 2000 RPMs, is probably what this is based off of, the case pressure is going to come up, because we're going to need more case pressure to try and get the fuel through all those small passages in a smaller amount of time. The rollers, they're technically, I guess, not stationary, but they don't spin. So the rollers are connected to a common rod. That common rod connects to the KSB, or timing advance mechanism, and that case pressure comes in and pushes on this side of the piston to move this back and forth. And then what that does is that rotates where the rollers are stationary at different positions. So we can see as pressure comes up, the piston moves and advances when the injection event occurs. So that's how the dynamic timing advance is done mechanically inside of the rotary injection pump. These rollers are right beneath the cam plate. So that's how that works. It's pretty straightforward. It's really basic. It was kind of fascinating to see that they machined a passage from one side all the way over to the other side. I would think it'd be easier not to do that, but that's how they did it. That's how I've done it. And I think most all their VE style pumps that do have a dynamic timing advance. So maybe it's old tried and true and don't mess with what works. So what the timing advance spacer does is, see how this bottoms out against in our case, it would be the outside of the housing of that cap. The timing advance spacer pushes this over farther, allows this piston to travel farther, meaning we can turn this race assembly even farther and get even more advanced timing out of the pump. We don't recommend running the plate if you have a gear jump advance on the pump. If you're going to do a gear tooth jump, then don't run a spacer or take the spacer out and only use the slots to do the time here. It is a real small one. I just found it while I was looking. But we can see our roller cage, our roller back here behind the cam plate. As the cam plate rotates, we can see with this straight line here that the plunger position comes forward. So from A, we roll up the roller, we get to B, and we roll down the roller, and we get back to our A position again. I thought this little demonstration or picture would help make sense of that. This thing is hauling. It's actually, well, it is rotating at 1/2 injection pump speed. All of our injection pumps on these engines spin at 1/2 engine speed. There's like another, just maybe a colored picture that was on there that can show as the plunger gets rotated and rides up the rollers. The cam plate rides up the roller. We can see that this is our plunger stroke. Now that doesn't mean that there's an injection event occurring during the entire plunger stroke. The plunger has to build pressure and then line up with the slots, deliver that pressure, and then the spill port should be uncovered before pressure starts to get too low, so we don't get poor plume quality into the engine itself. Oh, you can see here where the fuel is held and then pressurized as this rides forward, and then when this lines up with the distributor, the correct distributor slot, it will move that high pressure fuel into the injection lines through the delivery valves. So here's a picture of our cam plate. So these notches right here will lock in to the plunger system back here. The springs do not spin. There's these spins inside of this return plate. Only the plunger assembly itself, but these nubs lock into our plunger, and that's what rotates the plunger with the cam plate. We can see here, I found one that was for a 6-cylinder. We're going to have a lift lobe every 60 degrees. I think that's correct. Pretty 6-cylinder has to fire every 60 degrees of crank rotation. So these are being a 60 degree spread from each other. But sometimes these guys can get pitted. And when they start to get pitted, they do start to go fast. This is a case hardened part. It's called surface hardening or case hardening. The surface is hard and wear resistant, but as soon as it starts to pit, lack of fuel lubricity and stuff like that, they'll start to go really fast. We see the same thing happen with camshafts. So this is a 2.4 millimeter cam plate. So that means that it lifts our plunger 2.4 millimeters. That's as far as it goes. That's the effective stroke length. Now they have upgraded cam plates for called a 4 millimeter cam plate, which instead of lifting 2.4 lifts 4 millimeters. In practice, the 4 millimeter cam plates put into a non-modified VE pump They usually create a lot of heat because we are creating heat during the compression event of the fuel. Just like our turbochargers create heat when we compress the air, we also create heat when we compress fuel. And that heat tends to get absorbed by the parts. And these parts are machined to a tolerance, especially the plunger assembly, that is so small that they measure clearances using air pressure. They see how much air leaks by the parts in a given amount of time, and that tells them if the parts will pass the quality check or the inspection or not. They don't have feeler gauges or wire gauges like that to check clearance. They use air to check clearance. So the 4mm cam plate making more heat, if that heat isn't dealt with by running more fuel through the pump, tends to cause the plunger assembly to seize up inside of the distributor block, completely totaling a pump. The other thing too is we don't really seem to gain a lot of power with a 4mm cam plate, and that'll be something that we will go over in the future. I have some ideas as to why we are not seeing the fuel increase with more lift out of the plunger. Remember, more plunger lift is more duration, so we should see more CCs. But we'll go over why we aren't seeing more CCs or more power made with a 4mm cam plate in pretty much most applications. Right here we can see the backside of a distributor block. This is for a 4-cylinder. So we already know we're going to have an injection event every 90 degrees. If this was a 6-cylinder, we would have an injection event every 60 degrees. So there would be 6 delivery valves instead of 4. But it fires off all the injectors in a clockwise motion, even though the cylinder fire events aren't all going to be cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's why the injector lines are routed how they are, to make sure that the cylinder coming up on compression power stroke is the one getting the correct fuel delivery, so it runs the right way. There are some, I don't know if I've gone over it in an older video or not, but the non-intercooled delivery valves are supposed to flow more fuel. You can put the non-intercooled delivery valves into a intercooled holder. I think that's how they're doing it, so the intercooled guys aren't having to change their injector lines, because the thread pitches on the holder and the injectors do change from non-intercooled to intercooled. So we'll go over, probably maybe to end this video off and maybe get it kind of a good transition into the next one, is this thing is working its butt off. We got one plunger for 6 cylinders. So this thing's refilled, the time that it has to actually get the volume in the chamber refilled starts to dwindle as engine RPM goes up. I have a few ideas on how they're correcting that, because we are filling through the slots as well as delivering to the injectors through the slots. One thing that kind of might make my idea work is that we know if we put in a non-intercooled plunger into an intercooled pump, we'll pick up fuel mass flow. The non-intercooled plunger has wider slots in the plunger itself in comparison to the intercooled plunger. What that does is I'll probably have to draw this. What that would do is give us more time, or a longer window, to inject fuel into the thing. Okay. If we were to look at this as our plunger, and it's rotating clockwise, but at the same time it's traveling toward us and then away from us. It's doing two things at once. It's trying to create fuel pressure with one plunger and then deliver that fuel plunger to a fixed orifice hole. So the hole that it gets to deliver to is stationary. But this thing starts to spin faster and faster and faster and lift faster and faster and faster the higher we rev the engine. So what we kind of run into is this situation here where it builds up pressure and it's coming up on the distribution. So while it's traveling forward, it's getting close to firing off to cylinder 1. And as this thing uncovers cylinder 1, it starts to move fuel through this orifice. So what happens is there's a very short amount of time that this orifice is at full flow capacity, meaning there's only one instance where this orifice lines up with the fill port. And then after this moment in time, we are now fleeting past orifice. So our opening gets smaller and smaller and smaller very rapidly. So as engine RPMs go up, this orifice is uncovered 100% for a smaller amount of time. That smaller amount of time is why we're seeing the CCs of these pumps fall as engine RPM gets higher and higher. One thing is that it gets harder and harder to fill the space in front of the plunger, but the other reason, and I think this might even be larger than getting fuel to the front of the plunger, is that we have less time to fill and send fuel to an injector. So at low engine speed, we have more time to send fuel to an injector, and at higher engine speeds, we have less time to send fuel to an injector. And we see this can be understood through the fact that when we make the plunger slots wider, we pick up power. And that's because now with a wider slot, we can have a port that's uncovered here. Uncovered here, where both these sides are lined up, and as well as near start of injection is fully uncovered here. So we get more time that the port is fully uncovered and is reaching full fuel flow. When we go up to a 14 millimeter plunger versus the 12 millimeter plunger, we get also a wider slot because everything grows proportionally to the size of the plunger. That leads me to my next idea that we'll discuss in the next video about how we're getting a 12 millimeter plunger to move close to the same amount of fuel that the 14 millimeter plungers are doing. We're really not seeing any 14 millimeters come out. I haven't seen a new one in quite some time. But we are seeing 12 millimeter plungers make a big comeback in the VE world from THD, and Shy Diesel. They're making big numbers. They're making more horsepower than what Jason Sands did with his 14 millimeter pump back in the day. And that was a very long time ago. And we're talking fuel only. I think Jason Sands still has the record on spray of 996. I believe that's correct. 996 at the time. I don't think anybody has beat him yet, but we're seeing fuel only numbers out of 12 millimeter pumps that are more than his. I think he got into the high 400s, 470, 490. Fuel only was as much as the thing was doing. And then on spray, they took the thing all the way up to in the 990, 970 area. So in the next video, we'll go over that. I have some ideas on how they are accomplishing that. Probably going to end this video off on that, kind of leave you on a little bit of a cliffhanger. I thought that might be kind of fun. But I hopefully that goes over the way that the VE moves fuel now from the vane pump to the plunger assembly, and from the plunger assembly into the injection lines and into the injector. I don't know if there's any real way to get more detailed about it other than taking a VE apart, and sadly I don't have a dead VE yet, only a dead P700. The VE guys are going to like hearing that, so I put it in there. Make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment if you think I left something out, or you have ideas for future stuff, or you want us to add something to the last part of the VE series. The next part is probably going to be the last video in the series on VEs before we move on to the P700s. So leave a comment if you liked it, if you have ideas on maybe what we are going to talk about, anything, just have at it. And don't forget to hit the bell if you want to get notified when we put up our next video. Thank you for watching, and everybody have a good night or a good day whenever you watch this. Yep. I was going to say number 2 is going to come out soon But this video is gonna come out after number 2. Whoops.